The sun was getting low in the sky, painting the clouds in soft shades of orange and pink. It was that special time of evening in the small town park, where the day's heat begins to fade and a gentle coolness settles in. The annual summer fundraiser was in full swing, and the whole town seemed to have turned out. The air was a happy mix of smells, the sweet, greasy scent of fried dough from the food booth, the savory smell of burgers grilling on a rack, and the fresh green smell of cut grass. Strings of bare light bulbs were crisscrossed between the old oak trees, and they were just starting to glow against the darkening sky, casting a warm, flickering light on everything. Kids ran around with balloons, their laughter mixing with the sound of a local band playing a cheerful, slightly off-key country song from a makeshift stage. Near the stage, a man with a stressed look on his face and a clipboard in his hand was watching the band closely. His name was Dave, and he was in charge of the whole event. He was sweating a little, not just from the heat, but from the constant small problems that popped up. The ice machine was broken. The volunteer for the face painting booth had not shown up. And now his biggest worry was coming true. The band on stage was finishing their last song. The lead singer thanked the small crowd, and they started unplugging their guitars and rolling up their cables. They were done. And they were done a whole hour earlier than they were supposed to. Dave felt a knot of panic tighten in his stomach. An empty stage, even for just a few minutes, was like a hole in the side of a ship. The energy of the crowd would leak right out. People would start to look at their watches, finish their food, and head home. He needed something, anything, to fill the gap. His eyes darted around the park, searching for a solution. He saw a few teenagers he knew played guitar, but they were busy trying to impress each other by the refreshment stand. He saw a woman who sometimes sang at the church, but she was deep in conversation with the mayor. His eyes kept scanning, getting more desperate with every passing second. Then he saw it. Tucked off to the side of the stage, almost hidden in the shadows of the gazebo, was an old upright piano. It had been wheeled out earlier in the day for a performance that was canceled at the last minute. It was a bit scuffed, and some of the keys had a yellowish tint, but it looked sturdy. And sitting on the bench, almost blending into the background, was an old woman. She wasn't watching the crowd or the band. Her focus was entirely on the piano in front of her. She was gently tracing the outlines of the keys with one finger. Her touch so light, it was as if she was afraid to wake the instrument. She had a quiet look on her face, a soft, faraway smile that suggested she was a million miles away, lost in a memory. Dave saw his chance. It was a long shot, a desperate idea, but it was better than nothing. He took a deep breath, smoothed down his shirt, and walked over towards her. The closer he got, the more he noticed about her. Her hair was white and pulled back neatly in a bun. She wore a simple cardigan over a floral dress, and her hands resting in her lap now were wrinkled and marked with the blue lines of age. But they looked gentle. She seemed completely unaware of the chaos of the fundraiser around her, existing in her own small, peaceful bubble. He stopped a few feet from the piano, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice a little breathless from his quick walk and his anxiety. The old woman looked up, her eyes a soft, faded blue. She seemed surprised to see anyone standing there, as if she had just been woken from a pleasant dream. She gave him a small, questioning smile. Dave gave her what he hoped was a friendly and not too desperate smile in return. "I'm so sorry to bother you," he began, gesturing vaguely towards the stage. "I'm running the event here, and we've had a bit of a mix-up with the schedule. The band just finished early, and I have this. Well, this hole I need to fill." He pointed a thumb at the piano. "I don't suppose you play, do you?" The woman's eyes flickered from his face down to the keys, and then back again. For a moment, she didn't say anything. A complex mix of emotions crossed her face. Surprise, a flicker of fear, and then something else. Something sad and sweet all at once. It had been years. So many years since she had played for anyone other than herself. The piano in her own living room, the one her husband had bought for her as a wedding present, was her only audience now. She would play for him, or at least for the memory of him. Every evening after the sun went down, seeing her hesitation, Dave rushed to add, "It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Not at all. We just need something simple. Any song at all. just to keep the mood light while we get the next act ready. 10 minutes, maybe 15, tops. He was practically pleading now. Just some background noise, you know? The words something simple echoed in her mind. They were the same words her husband had used all those years ago. He had no ear for music himself, but he loved to hear her play. "Just play something simple, my love," he would say, settling into his favorite armchair with a book. "Something that makes the house feel like a home." A memory surfaced, so clear it felt like it was happening right now. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and they were young. He had come home from work, drenched and smiling, and sat down next to her on the piano bench. "Teach me a song," he had said. A real simple one. She had taught him "You Are My Sunshine." His fingers, big and clumsy from working with his hands all day, had stumbled over the notes, but he had laughed the whole time. His laughter, the most beautiful music she had ever heard. She looked at the man with the clipboard. He was looking at her with such hope in his eyes. The crowd behind him was a blur of noise and light. They weren't asking for a concert. They were just asking for a moment of music. A simple song. She looked back down at the keys, at the places where her husband's fingers had once fumbled. A warmth spread through her chest, pushing away the fear and the hesitation. It was just a song after all. A simple song for a simple reason. Taking a slow, steady breath, she looked up at Dave and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the tiniest of movements, but to Dave, it felt like winning the lottery. His face broke into a wide, relieved grin. "Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am," he said, his voice full of genuine gratitude. He gave her another quick smile and then rushed off towards the sound booth, eager to tell them the good news, leaving the old woman alone with the piano and the expectant, quieting crowd. The man with the clipboard gave her one last, grateful smile and then hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. The old woman was left alone, but the feeling of being alone had completely changed. Just a moment ago, she was invisible, a quiet observer on the edge of the celebration. Now she could feel it. A subtle shift in the energy around her. It was like a quiet tide turning, and all the currents were slowly beginning to point in her direction. The noise of the fundraiser, which had been a happy, chaotic wall of sound just moments before, seemed to be thinning. The laughter wasn't as loud. The chatter was becoming a low murmur. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were old hands, the skin thin and paper-like, mapped with a network of fine lines and wrinkles. The knuckles were a little swollen, a reminder of the arthritis that made some mornings difficult. But as she flexed her fingers, she felt a familiar strength in them, a memory of a lifetime of movement. These hands had held a newborn baby, had planted a garden every spring, had baked countless loaves of bread, and had held the hand of the man she loved as he took his last breath. And these hands had also spent thousands of hours dancing across these 88 black and white keys. A wave of doubt washed over her, cold and sharp. What was she doing? It had been so long. Not since the church talent show, years and years ago, had she played for an audience. Her playing now was private, a conversation between her and the ghosts that lived in the corners of her memory. It was for her and for him. To play it out here in the open felt like she was undressing her soul in front of all these strangers. What if her fingers were too stiff? What if the music came out rusty and weak, a pale imitation of what it used to be? What if they were disappointed? The thought of their polite, pitying applause was more frightening than any silence. Her eyes lifted from her hands and settled on the piano in front of her. It wasn't hers. Her piano at home was a dark, polished mahogany with a small, almost invisible scratch on the side near the sustain pedal, a mark left by a toy car when her son was a toddler. This one was a lighter wood, maybe oak, and it had seen its own share of life. There were water rings on the top, as if from countless glasses of lemonade or coffee, and a long, shallow gouge on its side, a battle scar from being moved from one place to another. But as she looked at the keys, they felt the same. The familiar pattern of the whites and blacks, the slight yellowing of the ivory that only comes with age and sunlight. They were inviting. She reached out a hesitant hand and let her fingers rest gently on the cool, smooth surface of the keys. She didn't press down. She just let them sit there, feeling the connection. And in that touch, the memory that had been flickering in her mind suddenly burst into full, brilliant color. It wasn't just a memory. It was a feeling, a sensation that washed over her so completely that the park, the crowd, and the setting sun all faded away. She was no longer on a makeshift stage in a town square. She was in the small living room of the first house they ever owned. The air smelled of fresh paint and the wood polish her husband had just applied to the new piano. It was a Tuesday, and it was raining outside, the drops drumming a gentle rhythm on the window pane. He had just come home from work, his hair damp and a tired, happy smile on his face. He shook the rain from his coat and hung it on the hook by the door, his movements full of a simple, grounded energy that she had always loved. He walked over to where she was sitting at the new piano, running her own hands over the keys in wonder. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. He stood behind her, resting his heavy hands on her shoulders, and she could feel the warmth of him through her thin blouse. "It's perfect," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "Now all it needs is some music," she had laughed. "I'm a little rusty myself. It's been a while since I've had a piano to play." "Doesn't matter," he said, squeezing her shoulders gently. "Play something simple. Something for us." She thought for a moment, then began to play the first few notes of a song they both knew. He listened for a moment, then his face lit up with an idea. Wait, he said, coming around to sit beside her on the bench. The bench creaked under his weight, just like this one was doing now. "Teach me that one. I want to learn." So she had. She had shown him where to put his fingers, his large, work-worn hands, looking clumsy and out of place next to hers. He was a man who could fix anything, who could build a shed from a pile of wood and a blueprint in his head. But these small, delicate movements were foreign to him. He fumbled the notes, his timing was all wrong, and he kept hitting the wrong keys, making the piano sound like it was in pain. But he laughed, a deep, infectious laugh that made her whole body feel warm. He didn't care that he was bad at it. He was just happy to be there next to her, sharing the moment. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine," he sang, his voice off-key but full of joy. "You make me happy when skies are gray." He looked at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and in that moment, she knew she would remember this rainy Tuesday for the rest of her life. It wasn't about the music. It was about the feeling. The feeling of being completely and utterly known and loved. A single tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a slow, warm path down her cheek. She wasn't sad. The feeling was too complex for that. It was a mixture of a profound, aching love and the sharp, undeniable pain of loss. It was the bitter and the sweet all mixed together. It's the very essence of a long life shared with another person. She became aware of the silence again. It was deeper now. The low murmur of the crowd had faded to almost nothing. She could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes on her. They were waiting. They were quiet. They were giving her this space, this moment, and in their patience, she didn't feel judged. She felt respected, as if they somehow knew this wasn't just a simple request for a song. The fear began to recede, replaced by a sense of purpose. This wasn't a performance. A performance is about showing off what you can do. This was different. This was about sharing what you feel. It was about taking a memory that was so precious, so intensely personal, and offering it up like a gift. It was about letting that rainy Tuesday, that clumsy, beautiful song, live again for just a few minutes. She slowly pulled a handkerchief from her cardigan pocket and dabbed at her cheek. Then, with a newfound resolve, she squared her shoulders. She straightened her back, feeling a familiar alignment, a posture she hadn't used in public for decades. She was no longer just an old woman at a piano. She was a conduit. She was a storyteller. And her story was ready to be told. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, lifted slowly and found their place over the keys. Her left hand settled into the familiar shape of a chord, her right hand poised above the melody notes. Her fingers, just moments ago, stiff with doubt, now felt loose and ready. She closed her eyes for a brief second, picturing his face, hearing his laugh. And then she took one last, deep, steadying breath, filling her lungs with the cool evening air. The hesitation was over. It was time. Her fingers, which had been poised with such resolve, finally came to rest on the keys. The cool, smooth ivory felt familiar and right under her touch, a perfect fit after a lifetime of practice. For a long moment, she simply sat there, her hands in position, her eyes closed. The world around her, with its fading light and quiet crowd, seemed to hold its breath along with her. It was a silence full of anticipation, not of emptiness. Then she began to play. The first note was not loud or showy. It was a single, clear C that drifted out from the old piano and into the evening air. The sound had a slightly worn quality to it, like the voice of an old friend telling a story you've heard 100 times but still love to hear. It wasn't perfect or polished. It was real. That single note was enough. It cut through the last remnants of chatter and noise like a soft knife through butter. A man who was telling a joke to his friend stopped mid-sentence, his head turning towards the stage. A little girl who had been fussing in her stroller went quiet, her eyes wide with wonder. The silence that followed was deeper and more complete than before. Her fingers began to move, picking out the simple, opening melody of "You Are My Sunshine." The notes were not struck. They were coaxed from the instrument. Her touch was incredibly gentle, a delicate caress that seemed to ask the piano for its voice rather than demanding it. The tempo was unhurried, a comfortable walking pace that gave each note its own space to breathe and be heard. It was the way someone would hum a tune to themselves, not for an audience, but for the simple pleasure of the melody. As the first few bars of the song filled the square, a wave of recognition passed through the crowd. It was a song everyone knew. A few people smiled, a soft look of nostalgia on their faces. A young couple, who had been standing near the popcorn machine, stopped talking and turned towards the music. The young man slipped his arm around his girlfriend's shoulders, pulling her a little closer. They swayed gently, almost without realizing it, their bodies responding to the simple, comforting rhythm. But there was something more to her playing than just the notes. It was in the way she held the melody, the way she lingered just a fraction of a second on certain notes, as if savoring a sweet memory. The music wasn't just a tune. It was a feeling. It was the feeling of a warm blanket on a cold night. It was the feeling of the first sip of hot coffee in the morning. It was pure, uncomplicated warmth. This wasn't a performance meant to impress with technical skill. It was an offering, a gift of pure, unadulterated affection. A group of teenagers, who had been laughing loudly by the entrance, fell silent. One of them, a boy with a skateboard tucked under his arm, nudged his friend and nodded towards the stage. They stopped their joking and just stood and listened, their usual restless energy replaced by a stillness that seemed out of place. The music was reaching them too, cutting through their youthful world of noise and distraction and touching something universal. The light from the bare bulb strung between the trees seemed to grow warmer as the sky darkened to a deep, velvety blue. The light caught the side of the old woman's face, illuminating the lines around her eyes and the soft, peaceful expression she wore. Her eyes were still closed, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she were listening to the music along with everyone else. She wasn't reading sheet music. She was playing from a place deep inside, a place where the notes and the memories were one and the same. Every chord she played was infused with a lifetime of love. The cheerful rising melody of the chorus was not just happy, it was joyous. It was the sound of her husband's laughter on that rainy Tuesday afternoon. It was the sound of him singing off-key, his big, clumsy fingers fumbling on the keys next to hers. It was the sound of pure, simple happiness, a memory so vivid and so powerful that it seemed to fill the entire park square. People didn't just hear the music. They felt it. They felt the love that had been poured into it. An old man sitting alone on a bench at the far edge of the crowd slowly took off his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief. He wasn't looking at the pianist, but off into the distance, a faint, sad smile on his lips. The music was taking him somewhere too, back to a time and a person that only he could see. That was the magic of what she was doing. Her personal story was becoming a canvas for everyone else's. The song continued, its simple structure weaving a spell over the entire gathering. The noise from the food booths had faded completely. The volunteers behind the counters had stopped what they were doing to listen. Even the children, who had been running around just minutes before, were now sitting on the grass, their faces turned up towards the stage, captivated. The entire town square, which had been a collection of separate individuals and groups just a short while ago, was now a single, unified entity, bound together by the sound of one woman and one simple song. She played the chorus again, her fingers dancing over the keys with a confidence and grace that seemed to defy her age. The music flowed from her, effortless and pure. It was a testament to the fact that some things, like true love and true music, don't fade with time. They only grow deeper, richer, and more profound. She had given them what they asked for, a simple song. But in its simplicity, they had found something incredibly complex and beautiful. They had found a piece of her heart offered up to them in the quiet of the evening. And as the familiar, happy notes of the chorus began to fade, the crowd held its breath, sensing that the story the music was telling was far from over. The last cheerful chord of the chorus hung in the air, shimmering for a moment like a small, golden sun. The crowd, caught in the warmth of that simple, happy melody, expected it to begin again. They were ready for another round of that comforting, familiar tune. But the old woman's fingers did not return to the starting notes. Instead, they lingered, and a single, low note from her left hand echoed out, deep and resonant, like a bell tolling in a distant valley. It was a sound that changed everything. The happy sunshine of the music was suddenly covered by a cloud, and a hush fell over the crowd that was different from before. This was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of listening, of leaning in to understand a story that had just taken an unexpected turn. From that single, somber note, a new melody began to emerge. It was the same song, but it felt like its shadow. The tempo slowed, her fingers moving with a heavier, more deliberate grace. The bright, major key of the opening verses had given way to a haunting, melancholic minor key. The music was no longer a celebration. It was a lament. It was the sound of looking back at a beautiful photograph and feeling the sharp, sweet pain of knowing that moment is gone forever. Each note was ached with a longing that was almost tangible, a fragile thread of sound that seemed to pull at the heartstrings of everyone who heard it. Her eyes remained closed, but her face had changed. The soft, peaceful smile was gone, replaced by an expression of profound sorrow. Her eyebrows were slightly furrowed, her lips parted just enough, as if to let out a breath she had been holding for years. She was no longer in the park square. She was in a quiet, sterile room. The only sound, the soft, rhythmic beep of a machine. She was holding a hand that was cool to the touch for the first time in 50 years. A hand that had built her world and now could no longer squeeze hers back. The music was the sound of that silence. The deafening emptiness that follows a lifetime of laughter and conversation. The melody she played now was the lesser-known verse of the song, the one that speaks of darkness and despair. You told me once, dear, you really loved me. The notes seemed to cry out, and no one else could come between.
What?
But now the music was asking a question. But now you've left me and love another. You have shattered all my dreams. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession of a heart broken not by betrayal, but by the final, unfair separation of death. The music was the sound of sunshine remembered through tears, the joy of the past made more poignant by the pain of the present in the crowd. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. A young mother, who had been smiling just moments before, felt a sudden, sharp lump form in her throat. The music was no longer a sweet tune. It was a mirror. She looked down at the small, sleepy face of her child in her arms, at the tiny fingers curled around her own, and a wave of fierce, protective love mixed with a primal fear washed over her. The thought of this perfect, precious moment, ever-ending, was unbearable. She pulled her child closer, burying her face in the soft, sweet-smelling hair, and felt her own hot tears begin to fall. Near the back of the crowd, a man with a thick, gray beard and a worn leather vest stood with his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like the kind of man who had seen a lot of life, the kind who kept his feelings locked away tight. He had been listening with a look of detached curiosity, but as the sad melody unfolded, his hardened expression began to soften. He thought of his own wife, gone 5 years now. He thought of the way she used to hum that same song while she watered her plants in the kitchen. He hadn't let himself think about it for a long time, pushing the memory down deep. But the music, this beautiful, sorrowful music, reached down and pulled it right up to the surface. He turned his head away, looking at the dark trees at the edge of the park, and quickly, roughly, wiped the back of his leather glove across his cheek. The emotion was contagious. It moved through the crowd like a quiet, invisible wave. An old man sitting on a bench who had been smiling faintly at the happy part of the song now had tears streaming freely down his wrinkled face, making no effort to hide them. A group of teenagers who had been standing with their usual air of bored indifference now stood perfectly still, their own youthful faces etched with a confusion and sadness that was new to them. One by one, people reached for tissues, for the sleeves of their shirts, for the hand of the person standing next to them. They were not just crying for the old woman at the piano. They were crying for themselves. They were crying for the loves they had lost, for the moments they had let slip away, for the beautiful, painful impermanence of life itself. Her music had given them permission to feel their own hidden griefs, to acknowledge the quiet sorrows they all carried. In that moment, under the soft glow of the string lights, they were not a crowd of strangers. They were a community of souls, connected by a shared human experience, all understanding a story told without a single word. The park square was no longer a place for a fundraiser. It had become a sacred space, a cathedral of collective memory and mourning. And the old woman at the piano was its priestess, guiding them all through the beautiful, heartbreaking service. The last note of the song hung in the air, soft and sad, like a final whispered secret. It didn't end abruptly. It seemed to dissolve slowly, its fragile sound fading into the deepening twilight until there was nothing left but the memory of it. And in that moment, the world stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with the weight of the story that had just been told, thick with the unshed tears of 100 hearts. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire town square was holding its breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter the beautiful, delicate spell the old woman had woven. The cheerful noise of the fundraiser, the smell of food, the twinkling lights, it all seemed like a distant memory belonging to a different world. This was now a place of shared feeling, quiet sanctuary created by music. The woman at the piano kept her eyes closed for a long time after the last note had disappeared. Her hands remained resting on the keys as if they were still connected to the instrument, still feeling the vibration of the story they had just told. Her shoulders, which had been squared with purpose, now seemed to relax, slumping forward just a little, as if a great weight had been lifted from them. Or perhaps as if she was finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion that came with pouring so much of herself out into the world. She was not a performer waiting for applause. She was a traveler who had just returned from a long and emotional journey, and she needed a moment to find her way back. Slowly, her eyelids fluttered open. The soft, faded blue of her eyes seemed to look out at the crowd without really seeing them. She was still seeing the past, still hearing the echo of her husband's laughter in the silence. A single tear, which had been welling in the corner of her eye during the sad verse, finally broke free. It traced a slow, glistening path down her wrinkled cheek, catching the warm glow of the string lights. It was not a tear of performance, but a tear of pure, honest memory. It was a tear for a rainy Tuesday afternoon, for a lifetime of love. And for the quiet ache of being left behind, her gaze slowly shifted, moving away from the faces in the crowd and down to the empty space on the piano bench beside her. She looked at that empty space with such an intensity, such a profound sense of longing, that it was as if she could actually see him sitting there. She could see his kind eyes, his gentle smile, the way he would tap his fingers on his knee when he was listening to her play. It was a look so full of love and loss that it was almost painful to witness. In that quiet, private moment, she was not playing for a crowd anymore. She was just a wife, missing her husband. And that simple human truth was more powerful than any grand finale. It was the sight of that single tear, a look at the empty space, that finally broke the silence. A man in the front row, his own face wet with tears, was the first to move. He brought his hands together slowly, creating a soft, solitary clap. It was not a loud or enthusiastic sound. It was a sound of respect, of understanding, of gratitude. Another person joined in, then another. The sound that grew was not the roar of a concert crowd. It was a soft, gentle wave, a rustle of appreciation that washed over the park square. It was the sound of 100 people saying thank you without a single word, as the soft applause continued. The crowd began to stir, but no one rushed the stage. No one called out for an encore. They just stood there, many of them wiping their eyes, looking at each other with a new kind of connection. Strangers were no longer strangers. They had shared something deeply personal, something that transcended their individual lives. The tough-looking man in the leather vest was now gently patting the back of a young woman who was sobbing quietly. The young mother was kissing the top of her child's head, a look of fierce love on her face. The fundraiser had been forgotten. The music had become the real reason they were all there. The old woman seemed to become aware of the applause, as if waking from a deep sleep. She gave a small, shy nod towards the crowd, a gesture of acknowledgement that was both graceful and humble. Then, slowly, she removed her hands from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. She pushed herself up from the bench, her movements stiff with age. She turned and walked away from the piano, not towards the crowd, but towards the shadows at the edge of the gazebo. She didn't look for praise or thanks. She had simply given what she had to give, as she disappeared into the night. A quiet space seemed to open up where she had been. The people in the crowd slowly began to talk again, but their voices were softer, their conversations more meaningful. They talked about the music, about the feeling, about the people in their own lives that the song had made them think of. The event organizer, Dave, stood near the sound booth, his clipboard forgotten in his hand. He had a look of awe on his face. He had asked for a simple song to fill a gap in the schedule, and he had been given a moment of pure, unfiltered grace. The old woman had shared a piece of her soul with them that evening, and in doing so, had reminded everyone in that small town square what it truly means to be human, to love deeply, to lose painfully, and to find beauty in both the sunshine and the rain.